So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us again for what is hopefully a last run towards the setup of the National Rare Disease Drug. I'm going to quit calling it a strategy. I'm going to quit calling it a framework. It actually has to be a genuine program. So this is our trying to put together everything that we've had and really looking at what do we need to put in place? Where do all the pieces that will help us to get it started? So those of you who have participated with us in the past know that we've had some amazing insights from all of our audiences. Those of you who had a chance to look at what we heard from Health Canada following their consultations prior to the election, I think would hopefully have recognized a lot of what you saw really reflected a lot of the thinking and conversations and input that we've had, for those previous almost 12 months leading up to that, though. And I think as we're now looking at it with the renewed commitment in moving forward, we're really trying to hold the government accountable to setting up an agency by April 2022. That has been our goal, and we feel like it's very well within our reach. Not to have a full-fledged agency, not to have a new building, not to have, all the pieces in place, but to be able to launch into a new direction. So I'm really delighted to have this webinar here, which is a lead up to our conference, which will be taking place on the 1st and 2nd of December. Hopefully you're all anticipating that and will be joining us, where we're going to try to put some of the pieces together. We thought this was an important opportunity, though, to do a very quick discussion with some of our leading experts to help us understand what were some of the key issues and what were some of the key initiatives that took place that we want to take into what's going to happen in the next in setting up this rare disease strategy. So as we've heard, there have been, really, we've done some amazing things in Canada. And I think it's really because of the goodwill of everybody from Health Canada to Kenneth and Inez to certainly the centers, our healthcare professionals that have been involved, the patient organizations that have also been involved to really try to craft together, the provincial governments in many cases, to try to craft together what would be solutions, but there were always one-off solutions. As we said, there are these bespoke initiatives. We really didn't create any blueprints. We didn't create any templates, and we seem to come back to it over and over again. I was at an International World Health Summit speaking about some of our experiences, and I can say again what I think many of you experience. It's a little bit like hand-to-hand combat. You kind of knock down one boogeyman and you kind of come up against another with no new learnings at that point. So what we want to be able to do is take some of the learnings that we've had, and we've got some of the key people been part of those learnings, help us understand what you learned from them, and use that experience then to say, okay, what do we need to put in place, not just as one-offs, but what do we need to put in place as building blocks for this next system? So next slide there. Oh, great, thank you. So we've got two panels that have been set up, and panels we're hoping that will be able to give us some really high levels. And you can see all the participants here. Peter Brendish, who's now with Beijing, who has a long-term, representative in terms of the rare disease community here. Brent Fraser with Kenneth, who I think has had many different roles and has been able to take that experience to help us craft even better how do we address these challenges with these innovative therapies. Ferry Jeevraj, who's with Biogen and who I've known also through many incarnations, who's going to talk to us a little bit about where we are now. Cheryl Greenberg, of course, you all know, and has been one of our most valued healthcare professionals in terms of actually doing the research, but also doing the clinical trials and being on the ground to help launch these initiatives. Susie Vanderwick with Cure SMA, who has been an amazing partner in terms of launching the rare diseases. So this is our first panel. And let's go through our second panel then is Brad Alward, who's now with Cord, again, has had many lives. Christine Cunningham, who's with Vertex, and we're delighted to have her kind of come in to give us a little bit of the perspectives and the challenges that have taken place with regard to access for drugs to cystic fibrosis. Angela Ganji, who's here from the Neuro at McGill, and hoping we'll talk a bit about the very unique experiences that ALS has had and maybe some of the challenges that are coming forward. So ALS will be one of those conditions that we're all looking at. Because if we can figure out how to make ALS work, we can figure out how to make a whole lot of things work. And there's been some amazing initiatives there. David Page from the Canadian Hemophilia Society, who is always my chief expert in terms of all things that have to do not just with the blood system, but looking at the challenges and really being able to articulate well. And as we followed the journey in terms of hemophilia access, some of those paving the way for us in terms of the other rare diseases, and sometimes really indicating to us what are some of the huge outstanding challenges that they're experiencing and we're all collectively experiencing. Beth Vanstone, of course, all of you have seen many times in terms of leading the fight in terms of cystic fibrosis. I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who will take us through some of the questions in the setup. So Bill Dempster, who is my genius in residence from 360.
Thanks so much, Durhan, and thank you to all of the panelists and respondents who have come on. That's actually the end of our slide deck and our slideshow, because we've got 10 folks who are going to have a lot to say. And this is not the end of what they're going to be able to say. We're going to try to keep it tops of the trees, but really what going back to what Durhan is saying, we're hoping to get a lot out of these webinars that will help inform the conference in early December and the next stages of Health Canada's and Canada's rare disease strategy, and especially Canada's rare disease drug strategy. So the way we're going to do this is panel one is going to come on. We're going to invite Peter Brenders, Farah Jibraj, and Dr. Cheryl Rockman Greenberg on to share a few perspectives on specific cases or issues that they have dealt with. We're gonna ask them three questions. What was the precipitating issue that led you to find or try to find a solution to an issue? What was the challenge? How did you come together, and who came together to craft a solution? And what was the number one success factor in making that happen, or major challenge? So Peter is going to talk a bit about something that lots of experience, because he was at the center of something, gosh, probably 20 years ago now, the Canadian Fabry Disease Initiative, or for Fabry disease. Maybe it's not quite 20 years ago, but it's getting pretty close to that length of time. Farah, and I don't see Farah yet. She'll get her video going soon. She's going to talk about Spinraza for spinal muscular atrophy. And Dr. Greenberg, you are going to talk about hypophosphatasia. And you are going to let me know if I mispronounce anything with that many syllables in it. Okay, good. So Peter, why don't you start? And then, of course, we've got respondents on the line. We've got Brent Fraser from CADIT, the VP of Pharmaceutical Reviews, Susie Vanderwyk from Cure SMA, and then Durhan will tag back in. We're on a really tight schedule, so please keep your comments crisp. Everyone on the line, and there are almost 100 people, please use the chat box to provide input. I'll do my best to consolidate things. But we're going to go through all three cases first, and then open it up for the discussion by the respondents that I just named. So Peter, over to you. Take us back in time. What happened with Fabry?
Great. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, it's 18 years ago, almost 18 years ago as a flashback, and sort of, geez, I sometimes don't remember what I did last week. But it's a fascinating look back at the time, because it was really one of the early rare disease therapies that are coming to market. And you got to remember, at the time, there was nothing for Fabry patients. The average male with Fabry disease would be dead at the age of 52 as things built. And you had a therapy that came through that got approved by the regulatory agencies around the world that made a difference. It changed. And yet, having that first treatment, that first solution out there that was offering sort of better hope and care for patients out there, ran into problems like all our drugs do out there. And you look back and you reflect, as it really is a question, like, why is healthcare so hard in our country? Why does, when we get a regulatory approval on something that on the risk benefit makes a difference in patients' lives, why is it so difficult for physicians to be able to treat their patients? And we get it. We understand sort of the questions. And so what the Fabry Disease Initiative was at the time was a way to, well, we need more evidence and we need to know that it truly is going to make a difference, and let's study it and let's create a made in Canada trial and track patients. And so as the manufacturers got involved, as the governments got involved, as the clinicians got involved, there was a research study put in place and it was followed, and patients got care and they were monitored. But what's interesting is you watch that over the years is, yeah, they were tracked, they were followed, the benefits were as they set out to be. And at the time, the CFDI just sort of died out after 10 years, 15 years. It just it just disappeared. And no one ever looked at the results of the study that was done to look at there. And it almost felt like it was just another hurdle to hinder care. Like everyone was interested in getting care that made a difference. And Duran, I know you said this time and again, patients don't want to be treated if it's not going to make a difference. And I think that was always the question that came in everyone's mind. So it was one of the early examples of where, yeah, companies would come forward, clinicians would come forward, governments would come forward to try and find that data. But it was always the question of mine is like, well, why couldn't we just make sure that patients had access? And yeah, we'll track it as we go.
Thanks, Peter. That was as crisp as they come. And we'll come back to the Fabry's issue when we get to the discussion. So stick around. Farah, over to you. SMA, Spinraza, what's happening?
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Duran. So with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, a rare neurodegenerative disease that affects, babies, children, adults. I'll give you a little bit of background. Spinraza was approved by Health Canada in 2017 and was for the total population of SMA patients. And it was the first treatment available in this disease where there was absolutely nothing else. And babies died before the age of 2, and children and adults continued to progress in this disease. And so, at that time, we then received a CADTH recommendation, an INESS recommendation, and INESS went on to provide access to all patients. And the provinces provided access to patients that were under the age of 18 and case by case for adults. And while initially some urgent adults got access across the country, many didn't. And this also did have, patients had concern around that, those both who were be able to access treatment, but also those who couldn't, because of obviously there was this inequity in treatment across the country. And so when we think about rare diseases, we have to think about, especially in disease areas where there's absolutely nothing else. We've obviously learned a lot through the research and development that we've done, but we continue to learn. And so, the important part is continuing to collect data to be able to learn. What we have seen through some of the real world evidence is the fact that, how patients benefit. We've even seen in certain patients who are on ventilators that they're able to come off their ventilators over time, and this is all the long-term benefit that can be seen through long-term data collection. So some of the challenges that we saw here in Canada, obviously there was this inequity in access, even to the point where, should age be a factor where some patients should get it and others should not? We've heard of a case in one of the provinces where a 13-year-old is denied access because the access only goes up to 12. Would there really be a difference in terms of the mode of action for a patient who's 13 versus 12? It's a question. And so I think that the other piece I'll leave with you is that, even from a private payer side, we see that there are differences in access. And especially because a number of private payers have also put in clauses where they will not allow for products to be reimbursed if they are received in hospital. And so there is definitely a gap there because a lot of rare disease drugs do need to be given in hospital. So I know I'm probably out of time, Bill, but I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Farah. That was excellent. Now we're going to turn to Cheryl. Bring us over to HPP and Strensiq. What's been your experience there and what's happening?
Thanks very much. Very happy to present today some of my experience and the current challenges. For those who don't know, HPP stands for hypophosphatasia. It's an inborn error of bone mineralization, and it's caused by the lack of the liver bone kidney enzyme, isozyme of alkaline phosphatase. And it's, as I say, it's an inborn error of skeletal mineralization. There's only one gene that's involved. And being here in Manitoba, I was approached early on by the company who developed the enzyme replacement molecule. At that time, it was called, the company was called Innovia Pharma, asked me to participate in clinical trials of a new therapy for a completely untreatable rare genetic metabolic disorder. And this was back in 2006. And I was delighted because we really had no current treatment for this disorder. There's 6 clinical forms. The 2 youngest forms, the neonatal form and the infantile form, or the perinatal and infantile, were universally fatal. And to make a long story short, over the next 10 years, we did do clinical trials centered in Winnipeg for this rare metabolic bone disorder. And patients came from around the world to participate in the ERT trials. And evidence was remarkably good for all the outcome measures for the most severe forms, the perinatal and the infantile forms. And ultimately, the clinical trials ended in 2016. And at that point, the PCPA began their negotiations. CADIS began its negotiations and its discussions, and made a recommendation to list the enzyme replacement therapy molecule called aspartase alpha, or Strensiq, as produced now by Alexion Pharmaceutical, for pediatric onset HPP, provided the patient was under 18 before beginning treatment. Okay, so that's how the product is listed. And clinical trials, I said, ended in 2016. Negotiations with PCPA began, and the product is listed on several provincial formularies who then did their own negotiation for the treatment. There are fewer than 24 patients in Canada who are treated with aspartase alpha based on provincial formularies. The adults with pediatric or adult onset HPP are not approved for ERT on provincial formularies. And the adults actually are the bulk of the patients now diagnosed with HPP, but they do not have access to treatments in Canada. Private insurers can occasionally approve aspartase alpha for our adults. And the company has provided compassionate access to about 8 adults with HPP, some of whom participated in the clinical trials and then were off treatment for several years, because as soon as the clinical trials ended, and this was not going to be listed on our formularies for adults with HPP, even the ones who participated in the clinical trials could not get access for drug, and were off drug for about 1.5 years before I was able to secure compassionate access. And these are for adults across Canada who took part in the trials. So here we have a problem now in 2021, where our infants and our young children, if they meet diagnostic criteria, and this is supervised by a national clinical expert committee, which is a very good body that's to help support indications for treatment for children and adults with HPP if they meet diagnostic criteria. But there's a huge gap, because there are adults with HPP, whether they're pediatric onset or adult onset, who cannot access enzyme in Canada. And that's a real problem for us clinicians who are trying to treat these patients. The evidence for adults is poor. I do understand that, but the company has not had any interest in doing any other clinical trials, which I think could help provide more evidence. The cost is very high. So how we're trying to approach this is review the diagnostic criteria, and indications for ERT are being looked at in adults by several expert panels internationally. We appreciate it's a better heterogeneous population. We need better evidence for adults with HPP. No additional clinical trials are being considered. We feel that one of the answers, of course, for these ultra rare metabolic diseases such as HPP is to incorporate real world data with properly controlled N=1 trials. So that's something that we'd like to move forward in any strategy, is how do we collect the data and the importance of properly developed and oversight for N=1 trials. So just before I end, we agonize over new pricing models and how we're going to access ERT for HPP, but hope is always there, because not only is there ERT that we continue to work on, but also there's new therapeutic options on the horizon, including very credible early gene therapy results. So I think I'll stop there now to try to give that overview for HPP.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. That was terrific. We're going to bring it over to our respondents, but just one last thing. You mentioned Enobia. I think people are really happy about those heritage moments when they see, the airplane in the air. They said that Bombardier, that's ours, right? Enobia was a Canadian.
Enobia Pharma was a Montreal-based company.
A Montreal-based company. Yeah.
It took several years into the clinical trial, and then Enobia sold out to Alexion, and it took me a while to realize Enobia was bone spelled backwards with an IA at the end. So
that's a great trivia point. Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate that. Let's turn to Brent to just, what do you think of what you heard, Brent, and where you sit, and you've had the experience as a payer in Ontario, and now, of course, as a leader at Cadith. What did you hear that resonated for you?
Well, thanks, Bill. I think maybe just a few points to highlight for folks. I can't speak too much on Fabry because that was not reviewed through Cadith, but I was at the ministry when the trial was being set up to collect the information between the two products. All I can say on that point is that the process itself was probably not as easygoing as some folks may think. We ran into a number of problems associated with the trial, the setup, with supply issues, changes in dosing, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result, when I had left the ministry, the way the status was at that point was that the clinicians could not identify any clear distinctions between the two treatments, and the recommendation was just to maintain funding. So that's likely why there hasn't been a lot of communication around the outcome of those trials, just because they really did not provide the information that the jurisdictions were hoping for. It also became quite labor intensive for the jurisdictions toward the end, particularly Ontario, who was sort of acting as the paymaster. And I would argue that although there's a lot of positive things associated with that trial, there's a lot of learnings that the jurisdictions took back if they were to enter into this type of an arrangement in the future. With respect to the other couple of products, I think a common theme was often around patient populations, and certain patient populations getting access, whereas others did not. I can tell you from a Cadith perspective, that's purely based on the evidence that's been put forward by the sponsor and the requirements within the clinical trials. And I can appreciate, a 12-year-old versus a 13-year-old. However, our committees have to manage the recommendations based on the evidence that they have before them, and they tend not to speculate into other patient populations at all, if it's at all possible. They do recognize that jurisdictions may have to manage some of these patients, and so there could be some softer language included in the recommendation. For example, in the Strensiq recommendation, there was a notation that there is no evidence beyond 12 years of age. However, they did recognize that there are patients within the jurisdictions about that age group. And as a result, you can see that the recommendation really just specified adults. And so we give the ability, or we don't give the ability, it's the jurisdiction's decision to determine what they're going to do from a reimbursement perspective. but some of the language that's a little bit softer is done purposefully so that jurisdictions could include, you know, a 13-year-old as an example, or maybe a 19-year-old through an exceptional type of review process. So that's really what the committee struggles with. Is we try not to be too rigid. We try not to include age cutoffs, if at all possible. However, if the Health Canada indication is specific to an age range, we will mirror what Health Canada has said in most circumstances. And if the clinical trials have a specific age cutoff, we will often reference that within our recommendations as well. And then it's really for the jurisdictions to determine how they're going to move forward with implementing those criteria. So I do want to support a couple things that Dr. Greenberg mentioned about the fact that we do need real world data collection for many of these products. We do allow for real world evidence to be included in our submissions. If it's the very first submission, we would tend to use the pivotal trials that were used for approval by Health Canada and augment that information with the real world evidence. We have seen in the past with some drugs that a resubmission process coming forward from a company may be completely based on real world evidence. And so we will sit down and look through that to determine what information is applicable to the reassessment that we're taking forward to our committees. So that is certainly an area that we are supportive of. And we do have people within CADTH that are starting to meet with the companies to talk about, you know, what RWE do you have? What's the source of the data, the completeness of the data, the quality of the data, et cetera, and they may provide some advice moving forward. I would also recommend, and this is more for manufacturers, we do have a scientific advice program that if there are questions around things like real world data collection, real world evidence, that's an opportunity for companies to meet with folks from CADTH to get some advice around the types of parameters that should be included within the submission, and in particular patient information with respect to quality of life and patient reported outcomes, et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brent. That was a great reaction from CADTH and from you and your experience, even reaching back to your days at the ministry. Susie, I see you might be behind that Cure SMA logo over there. There you are. Brent finished with talking about, you know, patient input. You have been at the front lines of Cure SMA from the beginning with so many personal experiences with it, and I've caught the bug too, just having, you know, getting out to some of your conferences. What do Canadians and people who are all trying to get this plan together need to know based on your experience around SMA and react to the you know, some of what Farah said in particular?
Yeah, I just want to give a bit more of a background for SMA. Is that, you know, 63% of the patients diagnosed with SMA have the worst form of the disease, where they are usually passed away before the age of 2. Mentally completely normal, physically on the decline. The rest of the population outside that 63% are also the same disease, just a slower rate of progression, but you know, we are at the end result is the same. They lose function and dramatically become more and more dependent on their caregivers. They're trying to hold jobs and maintain that ability of being contributing members of society. So until 3 years ago, when there was no available treatment prior, our fight since that development of that first treatment has been nothing short of exhausting from a patient group perspective. And due to the narrow inclusion criteria for rare disease drugs, the challenge for our community was to justify to payers the value to the patients who fell outside that box. We battled government, the cop-out of government to approve access based on that inclusion criteria. It's irrational to think that a patient up to the age of 12 would benefit, but one who is 20 wouldn't. And with recommendation from CADTH that is inclusive only on the inclusion criteria is it's unfair to the community. We know that they fall outside. And when CADTH makes a recommendation and refers to that inclusion criteria, it's an ability for the provinces to just stick right to what that recommendation is. It's been very, very challenging. And for us, we went from sending out end-of-life packages regularly to not sending out hardly any. Like in the last 3 years, I've hardly sent out any end-of-life packages. And as far as the adult patients who are continuing to decline, just referring, I think you can see in your camera what's sitting on the table behind me. These are wellness packages because the adults are crumbling under the weight of watching other patients access treatment, not only in Canada, the younger ones, but in other jurisdictions who are older and accessing and seeing a halt to their progression. And not only a halt to their progression, but actually a reversal of some of the effects of their progression. So for CADTH to stick to the inclusion criteria and say they don't see the evidence beyond that, it's for us as a community, you know, I'm sending out packages like this because I have patients who are suicidal. Yes, it's happened, and it's happened more than once. And the weight of that on an entire community is just crumbling. We feel like gladiators from the fight that we've done up until now. And it's been rewarding every time we can pull another couple onto the life raft, but we have people still in the water drowning, and we feel, you know, yes, more treatments are coming down the line, and we're going to go to battle. We're going to go to meeting, and we're going to picket, and we're going to bring media into it to try to bring justification and have the community stand behind us. But we're just like, I hope they hear us this time. I hope they save these lives too. And the sorry, I know you want me to end, and I will. You know, the model for the finances on this, we know that you have to take into consideration the disease impact on these patients, and to think that a walking patient, while it doesn't meet the financial impact on government because that patient is not costing the government a lot of money yet, the cost to the patient is loss of job. They're going to end up in a wheelchair. They're barely holding on to the ability to walk and just waiting for somebody to save their life. I just, you know, please hear us. Please make changes. Please include real world evidence, newborn screening, early access, and get these patients on treatment.
Thanks, Susie. One of the things we were hoping to hear from the respondents especially was what to do more of and what to do less of in order to, and it just hearkening back to what you said, Peter, before, you know, the question is, you know, why did we even bother doing that major study? And Brent, I really appreciated you coming back with some explanation about how the dose has changed, et cetera. You know, going back in the longer term history to build some of these programs, and then looking at the more recent examples. I mean, I don't know, Durhan, if you want to say some final words for this panel, or we can go across the board. But it looks like Canada needs a rare disease strategy.
Yeah, I think we can move to the next panel, and maybe hopefully if we can do some of those cases, I think there will be some common learnings. People have already been brilliant in terms of their response, and I'm hoping we can come back. And I will say is that what Brent is saying is so heartwarming, because we also have seen very recently that CADTH is now going to be looking at Spinraza for the adult patients and really asking for real world evidence. So, you know, we put the challenge out there, you know, in terms of CADTH being able to work with this real world evidence. And I think they're trying to step up to the plate. I think there was another very important comment, though, that I think Michael Ironman put in there, and that is, unfortunately, the haziness of some of these recommendations coming out of CADTH, you know, which Brent says allows provinces to absolutely expand if they want to, works always the opposite way. And that is, it allows provinces say, no, that wasn't recommended, so therefore we won't. So I think we want to get to some templates and some best practices out of this, but, looking at the intention there to get to that same point. So maybe if we can just shift to the next panel. This has been a brilliant discussion.
Thanks. And everyone who's on the panel or on respondents, we will potentially invite you back for comments. Put your hand up. Please use the chat box. I've said that before, and keep that discussion going too. So with the next panel, we've got Dr. Angela Genge. Angela, we did a tech check earlier, is Executive Director of the Clinical Research Unit at the Montreal Neurological Institute, or otherwise fondly known as the Neuro, which sounds like just the brain of Canada is in Montreal, and it happens to be between Angela's two ears. So we're delighted to have Dr. Genge with us today. We've got Christina Cunningham, Director of Public Affairs at Vertex Canada, to talk about Kalydeco and Trikafta for cystic fibrosis. And I've seen Christina. We didn't do a tech check, but I'm reasonably confident that you'll be on, Christina. And then we've got David Page, and I see David's been on already, so that's great. National Director of Health Policy at the Canadian Hemophilia Society. And David's got some examples around Hemlibra for hemophilia. So over to you, Angela. Take us through a little bit on Radicava and some other of the innovations for ALS.
Thanks, Bill. So ALS has suddenly been a very critical disease for Health Canada and for everything after Health Canada, because of the timing of all these initiatives corresponding to the timing of drugs being submitted for approval at Health Canada. So to run through, so historically there was a drug called, there is a drug called Riluzole or Rilutech that was approved in like 1998 or 2000. We have had nothing until 2000, and I'm going to say 17, because I always forget when the actual submission to Health Canada happened. When a drug we call Edaravone or Radicava had a positive trial coming out of Japan, and it was a drug that we had a lot of safety on. It slows the progression of ALS. So its positive result was a slowing of the loss of function in ALS patients by 30% compared to placebo controlled. The study was done the final study was done in Japan. It was developed in Japan. And they submitted to the FDA and got approval from the FDA, and were then actually asked to submit to Health Canada. What's special about this particular development program and the drug was that it was developed through an investigator-initiated process, because the drug was originally approved in Japan for acute stroke. So it's an IV drug that had only ever been given for 14 days in a row until it was developed in ALS. So it was submitted to the FDA. The FDA approved the drug on the results of the change in the functional rating scale over a 6-month period. It had the trial ended after 6 months and changed to an open label extension, and patients were continued on Edaravone. Once it was approved in the US, it was submitted to Canada. It has a couple of nuances in that it's an IV dosing once a day for 14 days, then a 14-day drug holiday, and then you go on these cycles where you get the intravenous once a day for 10 days of every 14. So we talk about it as cycles. Health Canada approved the drug, and then the company went through a very long process to get the drug on formulary in the various provinces, and I'll get to that in a minute. The company actually set up a SAP program, but because of the issues around Edaravone, in that patients were able to import it from Japan during the process by which it was being approved through personal importation. And the drug that was going to be provided in Canada post-approval was different from, not different in terms of its pharmacology, but was being sent from a distributor or manufacturing plant in Belgium. We were not getting it sent from an American manufacturing plant or a Japanese manufacturing plant. So the SAP program had a limit of 200 patients, and patients were enrolled from the ALS clinics across the country. So we had simultaneously this SAP program through Health Canada. We had personal importation for patients who could get it from Japan, and there was a particular clinic in Japan that was providing the access. And we were in front of, the company was in front of INES, CADIS, and PMPRB. I don't know if anyone from the company is on. I think it's just I'm the only one who has knowledge of this. The reason there wasn't as big an outcry on the patient side as we're getting with the current drug is the patients were getting it through one of these two sources who wanted to be on it. But the long and short of it was, because of the cost associated with Radicava, the infusions, the nursing time, etc., the PMPRB was a very difficult hurdle. INES was not a problem, but that I couldn't say that about a lot of things, having worked in Quebec now for a very long time. CADIS provided some hurdles, but when it came down to the costing, it became a huge issue. So in the end, they did not, I think the final listing for the drug actually occurred without PMPRB because it went off patent somewhere during the process that it was being evaluated by PMPRB and PMPRB because it had been around so long for stroke. So the company and the patients now have finally set up through insurance and through at least Quebec, but I don't think all the provinces still. I think it's only 5 of the provinces. I believe Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, maybe BC, although nobody, there's a whole issue with BC, are the provinces where you can get it most traditionally. Certain provinces, you do not have access to IV Radicava. And Health Canada, because they saw the problem with PMPRB, they kept the personal importation going like until a few months ago, so that patients could continue on the drug while they were waiting for the PMPRB decision. We are now post-event. The province where it's prescribed and used the most is Quebec. Ontario does have a certain number of patients on it, and as people are shifting off the personal importation, there will be a big jump because, in fact, the highest rate of prescription for Radicava was actually in one of the clinics in Ontario. And then you have this smattering across the country. So you have this situation where you have a drug that slows progression, like Riluzole slows progression, but there was the hurdle at PMPRB in terms of pricing meant that if Health Canada had not compensated for this in a variety of ways, patients would have actually lost access to the drug. That's Radicava. It is now available for patients whose physicians will prescribe it. There was a small battle with Health Canada, but very small. And actually not with Health Canada, more with CADIS and INES, to ensure that patients could be on both Riluzole and Radicava. The bigger hurdle is the one that's coming, and that is a drug called AMX0035. It's from a small biotech called Amylyx, and its study read out last summer or was published last summer, and demonstrated an even stronger effect on survival, on functional outcomes, with again a significant slowing of decline of function and a survival benefit of 6.5 months. That in other diseases may not seem like much. In ALS, a survival benefit of 6.5 months may be 1/3 of their survival post-diagnosis.
Angela, sorry, do you mind if I interrupt you really briefly?
Yeah.
Because the case study on edaravone was brilliant. It sounds like you're into another challenge with the new product that's coming through. Can we save some of those learnings
Yep.
for the next one? Because this is a really easy segue over to, I think, Christina with Vertex, who's gone through several of the same steps that I think edaravone went through around the challenges related to the PMPRB, and then Kenneth. But I've seen so many cystic fibrosis patients doing happy dances recently. So I don't know if you can tell us a bit about that, Christina, and just keep an eye on the clock for everybody, if that's okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll try to keep my comments pretty short. We historically have similar challenges with the HTA processes in Canada. Obviously, the pharmacoeconomic modeling, we believe is inappropriate for therapies that are lifelong therapies, as they don't properly assess the benefit to patient. We all share these consistent concerns. However, I will say, we were very fortunate in the experience that we had with our latest therapy, and we very much appreciate Kenneth and their collaboration on this file to align with the Health Canada review process, collaborating at the same time with INESS, and including the opinions of a clinical panel in their recommendation. We don't fully, obviously, agree with the initiation criteria that was imposed by CADF. We don't believe it's appropriate for CF management, but we certainly really benefited from those aligned processes in terms of timeline, in terms of access, in terms of even framing things out for payers about the importance of this therapy. So there were many things that went right, and I think it actually is a great demonstration of how nimbleness and speed can create fair and equitable access. And I believe we almost have consistent access across the provinces, and I think like record time. So now that took a tremendous amount of trust from both the payer side. We fully acknowledge that. From the patient side, and also from obviously Health Canada, et cetera, but we definitely see patients benefiting. So I would say we need to take a deeper look into how things worked so well and why they worked so well, obviously, but I do think this sort of joint benefit of having this collaborative spirit going into this was exceptionally helpful for this patient community. And I know Beth can probably attest to the amount of work that the patients did, I think, to build that goodwill, which is, as you know, these people are going through enough through their lives that that's not necessarily something we want to have to see repeated. But obviously, the trust was there and we were able to move things pretty quickly.
So, and Beth, we'll turn to you just after we hear from David. Thank you so much, Christina. One thing I would just say, and thank you to Glenn Monteith on the chat group, who clarified, Angela, that the edaravone is covered by all provinces except for PEI, which, Glenn, you should be particularly disturbed about, because I think you've got, that's where you're from originally. So get back to the island if you can and do something about that. But maybe there aren't any patients there. Over to David to talk about hemophilia.
Thanks, Bill. Yes, I want to tell the story of success and failure in the introduction of Hemlibra for hemophilia A. Now, hemophilia A has been treated by factor VIII, a protein, for the last 70 years. This is the first non-factor protein therapy that's come onto the market. And it was approved by Health Canada in 2019. It's used really across the developed world, and I think there are now more than 10,000 patients using it. So there's quite a bit of real world evidence out there. So first, Kenneth, I think Kenneth is more of a success story, or at least the rest of Canada, excluding Quebec. Kenneth recommended early this year that it be approved for severe hemophilia A. CBS went ahead and did a budget impact analysis and showed they could introduce it without budget impact, and so that made it much easier. And just actually last week it was officially introduced and is now being distributed for patients with severe hemophilia defined as less than 1%. That's a bit of a problem because they're basing the access on a lab result as opposed to clinical symptoms. So there are some patients who really need it who are being left out because of that particular decision by the provinces and territories. In the rest of, in Quebec, though, it's a different story. INES has reviewed the drug twice, and in both cases recommended not to fund. And they said there was a lack of evidence of non-inferiority, there were safety concerns, none of which we agreed with. Fortunately, the Transfusion Medicine Committee in Quebec, the CCNMT, made a different recommendation. They recommended to fund it. We haven't seen their actual recommendation. It's being held back by the ministry. So we have access to the negative one, but we don't have access to the positive one. And then just last month, the Quebec government made a decision. They overturned the INES decision, which I think is a first, and recommended unconditional access to children 4 and younger. But for those 5 and older, only if they decided that it was interchangeable with factor VIII, therefore it had to go into a competitive tender with factor VIII, and that tender will happen sometime in the future, we don't know when. So that basically barred access to people 5 years and over. There's no reason for the 4 or 5 years. They could have put the number at 18, 65, or 99. The research is with patients of all ages, and it shows great benefit in all of those issues. Just to compare the two, the factor VIII is IV, 2 to 7 times a week. Hemlibra is sub-Q, once a week. It maintains a steady state level of hemostasis, as opposed to factor VIII, which goes up and then down before the next injection. So there's some very obvious benefits to this. So we're working on trying to make the 1% rule a bit more flexible, and we're challenging the interchangeable designation by the Quebec Ministry of Health, which basically their definition of interchangeable is because we said so. They have no actual pharmacological definition of interchangeable. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. I know Brad has to jump off at the top of the hour. Brad, do you want to give a couple of what you think in terms of what you heard, and then we'll turn to Beth in terms of respondents, unless Dirhan, you want to go somewhere else? We're good. Brad, what did you hear from the 3 case studies that really struck you?
Yeah, I guess just really quickly, you know, and many of the points that were raised by the folks that highlighted the case studies in both panels are very familiar to me, you know, coming from a previous role within the PCPA and the payer community. You know, maybe a couple of comments and then I have to run, unfortunately. I think that there is an awful lot of positive progress at the systemic level. So initiatives that Court has been a big part of, but including CADITH and others, to really look at real world evidence, because, you know, as was raised in the chat, it's although, you know, everybody I think fundamentally believes that funding decisions need to be evidence-based, the lack of evidence and the inability to study anything and everything is all too often a reason just to kind of say no, right? And, you know, through my kind of various experiences, it's tough, if not impossible, to really kind of pin down the people who will ultimately make those funding decisions, the payers, and get them to engage in conversations about, okay, what is it that could be compelling from your standpoint? So, you know, it's great to see certainly some movement involving CADITH and others to look at real world evidence. But I would suggest, I guess, and I look through the participant list here, I still don't recognize or see any current payers. And unfortunately, it is a challenge to kind of bring folks that actually sit in these decision-making roles to the table and engage. But until until there's kind of a place where they can do that a little bit, maybe in a safer space, it's going to be challenging, I think, to make some real progress in terms of implementation, because under the current system, ultimately everything lands at the feet of the payer. And if they can just, stand behind a CADTH recommendation about the absence of evidence or the evidence that's been provided not being compelling enough, then we'll end up with much of the gridlock that we currently have.
And Brad, when you were a payer, you came out to every court conference that you were invited to. So I think that, you get even years later, hats off for doing that. And Brent, same thing to you when you were a payer. So it's great to have you both out again today. Beth, reactions, thoughts. What do you think we should take away?
Well, I think firstly, I'm a strong believer when we know better, we do better. And I think we're learning a lot through the process. I've been advocating for CF patients for modulators for nearly a decade now. And in those 10 years, we've seen things improve, like the last negotiations for Trikafta, things moved smoothly once we got through the PMPRB issue. So it was like one step forward and 2 steps back. So we spent more time working to get that drug submitted to Canada so that we could have patients on it than we did actually getting through all the negotiations, because those moved rather quickly, and we certainly appreciate that. The other part is the CADTH recommendation. Now, they did do a pretty thorough job, obviously. They did rewrite the review, the initial CADTH review, the proposal, and took back some feedback, which was amazing. However, one of the sticking points was the 90% lung function requirement that kept out, I believe, something like 25% of patients. And we need it, everybody needs to be on it. It halts the disease. So we need these patients on it. We need them on it before the brain damages lungs and they can't get back. We learned through all the processes of Kalydeco and Orkambi that you have to cover every single point. And that being said, that when we negotiated and spoke with our Minister of Health in Ontario, we saw that the recommendation, the final draft, included the 90%. And we went really hard with our minister to say, like, that is not okay. And we were lucky she listened and did make a kind of caveat to that so that patients over 90 would still be looked at. Clinicians need to be more involved in these decisions. I think that's a big piece that's left out. I don't think that people sitting in a CADTH office can always have a full understanding of the benefit of some of these drugs. So, and also, of course, having to have it province by province by province. And, you wait long enough to get these drugs done, negotiated, and then to have to fight every province along the way again while people are passing away literally while they wait. So I think we've come a long way. I think we have a long way to go, and having all these experts, I think, to learn from and collaborate to make a better pathway is key to making things better. I'm 10 years into this. I don't want to do it for every single drug. We need to get this done and do it right. So I think this is a great step in the right direction.
Right on. So we're actually at the top of the hour. We've managed to get through 6 case studies, 4 respondents. Durhan, do you want to wrap it up, or do you want to keep it going for another few minutes?
I was hoping that we could ask the panelists how many of them can stay on with us for maybe another 5 or so minutes, because it would be great to get some final recommendations going forward from each one of them. And even if we don't keep all of our audience, it will be recorded. Really, this is a learning for what do we need to put in place. So maybe if you don't mind, Bill, we can ask everybody to go around and give us what is their top recommendation. We're building this rare disease drug strategy, and Beth, I'm with you. I'm tired of this. I was there with Peter when we first did Fabry's, and sometimes I look up and say, good God, am I doing the same thing again? I do not have another 18 years to do this. So I would really rather not do this and rather sit at home and play with my grandson or something. So and David, you and I have gone back way before that. So we've been 25 years in this. We don't have this time left over. So, maybe from each one of you, what did you hear? Not just on your own case, but top recommendations going in. I'm going to say is that we're going to pick this up on our December 1st and 2nd conference. We will we will go from here, and I'm hoping every one of the panels that were on here will be part of that discussion going forward. So Bill, maybe I'll leave it to you.
Sure. I don't know if Peter was able to stick around. I think he might have had to step off because I don't see him. So let's go down the list and maybe he can come back if he's still there. But Farah, you're there. You were the second panelist up. What's the number one thing to pick up for the Canada's rare disease drug strategy?
Yeah, no, thanks. And this has been a fantastic discussion. I think very clearly, and I think we're on the path there, but, and I think Duran sent it as well, is rolling submissions and really looking at the real world evidence. I think also, the other piece we have to just make sure is that, with some of these rare diseases, we're also learning as we do the research and development. So I think we have to have that amenability, the ability to be able to review what some of these outcomes look like over time, what is important from a patient perspective, what should be included as part of that discussion. And it can't be a hard and fast rule, but we need to be looking at it over time and rethinking about, have we done it right?
Thanks so much. And the idea of rolling submissions, by the way, has been incorporated by Health Canada for COVID therapeutics. That's something that I think, Durhan, we should pick up on in December. What are the lessons from the pandemic that we need? Has everything changed in Canada to really open up the space to think differently and to find new solutions? But let's put a pin in that, if that's okay. Dr. Greenberg from Winnipeg.
Hi. Well, I keep hearing, and these talks have been fantastic, about the importance of how we're going to incorporate real-world evidence in the funding decisions, etc. And I had some brief discussions offline here with Brent, and I was interested in how physicians or other bodies, lay groups, can actually present demonstration projects or data to CADIS to relook at real world evidence, or is this always going to include needing to have the N=1 or real world evidence come from the sponsor? So, for example, in hypophosphatasia, it's not likely we would get Alexion to want to go back to CADIS to look at real world evidence for an N=1 patient, but that patient is very important to us. And do we have a mechanism in Canada where either physicians, clinicians, patient bodies can actually make a presentation to CADIS, a demonstration project or whatever, to look at real world evidence?
Thanks so much, Cheryl. And if you'll pardon a pun, you are doing more than just putting meat on the bones. You're actually creating the bones. So this is great. Keep it up. Brent, over to you. What's the number one thing we should take away and do?
Well, I agree with the rolling submission piece. I think that the need for us to continually update our recommendations is important. I would also just be cautious around the term rolling submissions, because I think on the regulatory side versus non-regulatory, there's different interpretations of what that exactly means. But for me, I think it's really looking at recommendations are made at a point in time. And if there's significant information that has come forward at a later date, depending on what that time period is, we do have a mechanism for jurisdictions and for manufacturers to request a reassessment of some of this evidence. I think that's going to be important to figure out how do you make this more routine going forward, which can be sustained. I think obviously you need the resources to be able to collect the data as well as to assess the data.
Thanks so much, Brent. That's great. And thanks for coming today. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Susie, Susie's got her logo off. Cure SMA, what are we gonna do?
Raring to go. A couple things, not saying the same thing again, because obviously real world evidence has its value and is needing to be incorporated, but also interim access while we're in discussion and these patients are progressing in the interim here. This needs to be addressed and have a solution for it. Also, the inclusion of input from clinicians and physicians who are experienced with a particular disease, and value to patient input as well. You know, that's
maybe you were picking up from the Radicava example that that Angela talked about, how there was access even throughout for ALS. So this is great. You know, cross pollination of some of these case studies. Panel 2, Dr. Genge, thank you for sticking around and for making it today. What's the one thing that we should take away from and do to make Canada's rare disease drug strategy a reality?
I think we have to keep the patient groups heavily engaged. The physicians are not what the people who finally make these decisions care about. We can be the experts, but it's the patient voice that's made the difference in ALS and will continue to make the difference in ALS. And if there are multiple patient groups, they should all be engaged. Even if there are differences of opinion in terms of approach or strategy, find a way to get everyone engaged. It is going to be pivotal on our next file. And it was really patients who kept the personal importation open for Radicava for as long as it was. It was patients directly contacting Supriya Sharma to keep it open. So we provide the expertise, but the patients are what makes the difference.
Well, and especially in ALS, just a quick shout out to Dean Gorseline, military member who has ALS and would walk around Parliament Hill to raise awareness. And so stories like that and heroes like that, I completely agree with you, Angela, or, you know, we need to see and hear more from them. Christina, what's the one thing that we should do?
I think from a HTA perspective, just, you know, better input from clinics that are clinicians that are actually dealing in the disease area is like paramount. It permeates every part of this sort of process, and I think a more formalized structure where physicians and the patient community can participate is very beneficial.
Amazing. Thank you, Christina. David, back to the blood of the situation. Tell us more.
Well, I think we need to help Kadeth and Ines, and perhaps in our case, especially Ines, better evaluate drugs for rare diseases. They did not seem to understand the research that they were reading, and they kept referring to small studies, bias, and that was roundly criticized by all the hematologists across Quebec and Canada in terms of Ines's ability to properly review a drug for a rare disease. And it's not even that rare a disease.
Something that's come up, just to build on that really briefly, David, and what we can again go into it in December, you know, even a patient auditor or somebody who sits in on some of these expert review committees, just to hear how these things are being discussed, because right now we kind of get the recommendation and you know, really don't have a clue of what's going on. So something like that to sort of see how these things are discussed would be something to potentially think about to answer that question. Beth, if you can still, I see your camera's back up, but thank you for sticking around. You have the last word among the panelists and respondents before we head back to Durhan. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I always like to have the last word. I think that we need to keep patients in the center of all of this. I think that's always that we're doing all this work for the patients, manufacturers, the government is supposed to be working on behalf of patients, and keeping them in the center of this is key. We need to get a pathway that recognizes these drugs need timely access. We need to get them, and we need to get them there quickly. ALS is a prime example of that. It's heartbreaking to watch patients wait when they shouldn't have to. We wait and wait and wait. So this needs to be done. And keeping clinicians, again, in the center. They have to have more of a voice at the table. They understand, they're specialists. They understand these diseases better than anybody other than the patients. So we need to listen to them, and we need to be able to have their voice heard at the tables that are making these decisions. So
Amazing. Well, thank you, everyone, panelists, discussants. Durhan, do you want to close it out, and then we'll see you very shortly.
I will indeed. And again, my huge thanks to all the panelists for their contributions, for doing it, in such a tight, confined time space. I wish we had a lot more time, but we will on the 1st and 2nd to explore this again and really drill out the recommendations. And huge thanks as well to Bill for the moderation. But let me just sort of follow up with what I think is really important, and that is we need the clinicians and we need the patients, and they need to be in sync. And we also need the patients to be more evidence oriented. We're talking about real world evidence. So what counts as evidence? Our commitment, and I know hemophilia has been huge in this, commitment to submitting your evidence, commitment to being able to stay engaged in order to make sure that evidence is going to be high quality evidence. That's huge. But the clinicians have got to be, the clinicians are the ones that are actually have to collect this evidence in many cases, are going to be the ones that are going to be in charge of it. I can remember the day when we walk into a MIDI and nobody wanted to talk to a patient unless the clinician was there, or we make a comment and we make a recommendation and their immediate thing was, well, what do the clinicians think? So this is very, very important. And we still need those clinicians there. We need more clinicians to be like the clinicians that we've seen here with Cheryl and Angela. We need them to be advocates. And I think, we've seen a redefinition of that role. So I think the clinician and the patient community coming together and working in tandem is the strategy going forth in this rare disease. Because we've all heard it, managed access programs, real world evidence, that's the core. We're seeing that internationally. I just came back from Europe and we were really in discussions around how these managed access programs are going to roll out there and across Europe. And even ICER in the US is now looking at what are the special strategies we need in order to deal with rare and ultra rare drugs. So, I say again, with this rare disease strategy or framework or Canada's rare disease drug program, we can be #1 in the world if we can continue on the track that we're doing in terms of bringing all the stakeholders together. So huge kudos to everybody. Hopefully we'll see you on the 10th. We're going to be talking about diversity and ethics.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care. Lunchtime for those of us in Ontario or around here.